Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at the advanced information for the summer of 22 for A-level politics, in particular component 2 from edXL. So in this I'm going to look at the what the board has released in terms of which topics are going to be on the exam, and talk about some of the potential questions that might possibly lead to. So first of all, what the paper look like? Well, you will have a choice of two source questions, which are worth 30 marks. And it could be from any of the indicated parts of sections 1 to 4 of the spec, and I'll go through the indicated parts of those in a second. And then you'll have part B, which is a choice of one of two essays. And again, this can be taken from the indicated parts of section 1 to 4 of the spec. And then part C is your choice of non-core ideology. You'll have studied a particular one. So, for example, I teach nationalism, and that's the one I'll look at. But the principles of this applies no matter what your non-core ideology is. Now, in terms of the parts of the spec, we're going to go through kind of section by section. So the first part is section 1 of the spec, and that has picked out a couple of key elements. The first one is 1.3, the role and powers of devolved bodies in the UK. Now, one of the things that I've done already is I've produced a load of content videos. I'm going to put these together in a playlist for this particular bit. You'll see I've already done one for component 1. There is my A-level politics playlist, which is about 160 videos long, which covers all the different bits. But for 2022, what I'm going to try and do is create a shorter playlist, which has just got the ones that you need for the particular bits that the exam board has picked out. Now, what this part of the spec talks about is devolution, and it talks about devolution in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So a question on this is likely to get some kind of comparison about the way that this has worked in the different places. Now, there's a strong argument, for example, that it's worked much better in Scotland, for example, than it has done in Northern Ireland, where there's been big problems with the power sharing agreement. And a lot of the unsolved problems remain in England, where there isn't a kind of a uniform system, and we get real problems like evil English votes for English laws. So evil. I'm not quite sure how we're supposed to say it, but there are things that are left there. We have special arrangements for London. We have city regional mayors, but not everywhere. The idea of regional devolution didn't happen. Could you have an English parliament? There's all kinds of stuff that's still going on there. Well, on the spec, it's done as the Welsh Assembly. Obviously, it's gone on and become the Welsh Parliament. There's been loads of really interesting stuff happening with devolution during the COVID crisis, as we've seen the different countries taking slightly different approaches. And that's really kind of asserted again some of the significance of devolution. So combined with 1.3 on the spec, in the advanced information, we have 1.4. So this is the debates on further reform. So the first one is an overview of the extent to which individual reform since 97 listed in 1.2 above should be taken further. Well, it might be taking a slight risk, but in a way, almost do we look at that and kind of go, well, 1.2 hasn't been included, so maybe that bit we can ignore. The extent to which devolution should be extended in England, well, that definitely looks like a possibility. Whether the UK Constitution should be changed to be entrenched, codified, including a Bill of Rights, well, again, that one absolutely, definitely could be. So, and though again, I've done videos on all those different bits, and we then got to ask ourselves, what kind of questions might we get? Well, we could get something on constitutional reform since 97 and whether it's gone far enough, because that we do have that part of 1.4. But since we haven't had 1.2, then that would maybe suggest that isn't the most likely. We've had the view that so far devolution has been a success for all countries but England, where it needs to be extended. So something like that is really likely to have highlighted that one in green, because we've got devolution on there, and then we've got the debates, and one of the debates is about the extension of devolution in England. So something like that seems really likely. So you do need to know devolution in a lot of detail, in particular look at the ideas about how devolution could be extended in England. Look at evil or evil, depending on how you want to say it. Has that worked? Think about things like the West Lothian question. Think about arguments for and against the English Parliament. Think about arguments for and against regional government. Look at the action of the city region mayors, for example. Look at what happened in Manchester and Liverpool during the COVID crisis. So there are plenty of things in there. London as another example. The very new later stuff on this is the talk of the levelling up agenda from the Conservative government, and this idea of kind of greater power for local councils. And then another possibility from that is evaluate the view that the UK should adopt a codified and entrenched constitution. Again, maybe that was slightly less likely. It's definitely a possibility because it is on there, but again, I'm not sure why they would have devolution and this section if it wasn't going to be maybe devolution on it. But there might be, for example, if this ends up as a source question, then you could have stuff that covered a variety of areas. And all these things are hugely interrelated, and so therefore you could get a combination across. So if you're prepped for questions in all three of those areas and absolutely nail devolution, then you should be in a really good place for whatever comes out of section 1. A thing to remember for component 2, that it says on all questions on this unit, your answer to draw relevant knowledge and understanding in study component 1, and you must consider this view in an alternative way, in a balanced way. So balance is key as always. One of the difference to component 1 is in component 2 you don't only use the stuff from component 2. You also bring in stuff you've learned in component 1, and so there's lots of stuff that you could bring in here in terms of ideas on democracy and participation, and other bits you could bring in, maybe the electoral systems, definitely stuff to do with the parties and the views of the parties, growth of minority parties, notably the SNP, if you're talking about devolution. For section 2 of the spec, then we've got 2.2, the comparative powers of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, 2.3, the legislative process, and again, I've produced videos on those. So you're looking at the powers to start off with, and then you're looking at the process. So it's this bit is relatively straightforward in terms of this is a kind of a big blob of content to learn. So you know the comparative powers, you know about whether the power of the Lords is re-emerging. For example, over Brexit, there was an idea that the House of Lords started to hold more sway. The power in Parliament, and where that is placed, and all that stuff is important, and how law is made and the different processes it goes through. So make sure you know all of that. And then we've also been given 2.4. So this is the ways in which Parliament interacts with the executive, and again, I've done a video on that. And you've got the role and significance of the backbenchers in both houses, including the importance of parliamentary privilege. We've got select committees, the significance of the opposition, and then stuff there on ministerial question time, including PMQs. So we've got a combination there of 3 areas. So we've got the powers of the various bits of Parliament, we've got lawmaking, and then we've got the way that Parliament interacts with the executive. So what does that mean they could ask you then? Well, it seems to suggest that you might get something about evaluating the power or role of backbenchers, lords, and opposition in either scrutinising the government or in lawmaking. You could get something along the lines of to evaluate the view of the UK as an elected dictatorship. So this idea of the dominance of the executive over the legislature, which is an interesting idea and one that you might well have teased out in your when you were learning about all of this. And you could get one more directly on the House of Lords. So the House of Lords is no longer fit for purpose, and this would maybe link to some of the stuff from section 1 in terms of the debates about whether reform could go further. So definitely Lords reform and whether there's a need for greater Lords reform is definitely something worth having a really close look at, because that potentially could be something, if you combine some bits of section 1 and section 2 together, that they could definitely get a question out of. So all of that stuff is things that you should be looking at. So that and that a lot of that is out of 2.4, but the background behind it is you need to understand the legislative process and bring in loads of examples from that, and you need to know loads of information about the comparative powers of the different parts. So I would do things like build revision materials around the kind of the power of the opposition, the power of backbenchers, the power of the House of Lords. I would look at the two sides of whether there's an elected dictatorship or not. So you could talk about moments where the executive is hugely powerful, can do what it wants. So, for example, when it has a large majority, and particularly if it's got a large majority, you're just after a general election. When it's won that, it's got a strong mandate. When it's pushing through legislation, which was in its manifesto, and therefore the Salisbury Doctrine kicks in. When it's releasing budgets, when the House of Lords can't touch it. And then there are times when this idea of the executive being overly powerful, it can be dismissed, because we again over the Brexit crisis with this, where the government essentially lost control over Parliament for a period of time, and it couldn't get through what it wanted, and with Bercow allowing a whole variety of different amendments and stuff being brought in. And in that, we saw a real kind of struggle and an idea that Parliament was reasserting itself with backbenchers. We've got things like the Backbench Business Committee. You can look at things like private members' bills. You can also talk about opposition days. And you can look at effectiveness of PMQs and the impact that has, and you could bring in broader stuff from component one, for example, on the media on that, and how Prime Minister's Question Time plays out with kind of media coverage of it. So there's lots of stuff in there, and again, there's lots and lots of different potential questions in there as well. But it's something you should be able to give yourself a broad preparation on and practice answering questions in that kind of area. From section 3, we've got the role and powers of the executive and the concept of ministerial responsibility. So with these, again, there's the videos on there, and again, they'll all be on the relevant playlist for the advanced material for component 2. So a lot of this links in with ministers and cabinet, because we've got the first bullet point of 3.1 that does, then obviously the entirety of 3.2, and then we've got roles, proposing legislation, proposing a budget. So a lot of this then links back to section 2 as well. And the main powers of the executive, including royal prerogative powers, initiation of legislation, and secondary legislative powers. This all kind of connects really firmly, the two section 3 and section 2. Now, the most likely one, it seems, out of that, the one thing that it seems quite clearly is going to be on the exam in some way or other, is cabinet, because of the inclusion of the second of the bullet points on the sections on the previous page. So something evaluating the view the UK has returned to cabinet government, or we've seen a decline in cabinet government, is something that is quite likely. So think about the most recent governments, and most recent, my view on most recent might be different to yours, but you go back to the coalition government, and you've got the quad of Cameron, Osborne, Clegg, and Alexander, and the role that they played in bringing in running the country at that point in time. You've got the Conservative cabinets with its division over Brexit. We even had the suspension of collective responsibility during the campaigns on Brexit. You could argue that Cameron and May were far less presidential than some earlier prime ministers, for example, and most notably Blair and Thatcher. We saw the resignations from cabinet under May, which proved to be very significant, with Boris Johnson himself, and then we saw mass resignations when Johnson came into power as well, and also some very significant non-resignations. So, for example, when we had the storm over Priti Patel and claims of bullying, and she was found to have done it and then didn't resign, which seems to be an ongoing theme with Johnson's government, the idea of not resigning when in earlier time people would have done. So have we with Johnson seen a return to a more presidential style prime minister? And think about a lot of the examples of things that are going on. So what can you take out of what happened during COVID crisis, with the pushing of the levelling up agenda, with the cost of living crisis, with Partygate? I mean, with particularly those last two, are there cracks appearing within Johnson's cabinet, and are we seeing divides and party lines and factional lines being drawn? So, for example, there was quite a lot of stuff in the press about Sunak and Johnson disagreeing on the approach to dealing with the cost of living crisis. And then not long afterwards, the stuff about Sunak's wife got leaked. And then we've seen the stuff with Partygate. And again, we've got this idea that Sunak wanted to resign and was talked out of it. Johnson definitively didn't. And what that shows about the way that the country's been run, about the way the cabinet is operating. Is this something that's been directed straight from the head in terms of the prime minister? How much cabinet involvement is there in key decisions? And again, remember to draw on your knowledge from component one to help you with all this different stuff. So particularly stuff on democracy, a lot of stuff on electoral systems would work with this in terms of the way that we end up with governments and the ideas of majorities and mandate and stuff like that as well. So again, lots of interesting stuff in there. Section 4, they essentially has only picked out one bit, which is 4.1. So in essence, there is no excuse to not go into this exam without detailed knowledge of the Supreme Court, and in particular its interactions with other parts of the UK system. One of the joys of the UK Supreme Court is that it's a baby. It's not been around for very long, and therefore there should be not an enormous amount to pick up on. I mean, there has been some important stuff around things like the Human Rights Act and the proroguing of Parliament and stuff to do with Brexit. So there's plenty of good examples that you can go and find and you can look into there. Again, there's a video on this, and so you need to know the role and composition of the Supreme Court, operating principles, and the degree to which it influences both the executive and Parliament. And it's at that last bullet point that questions are most likely to come. Again, you might get something that covers more purposely all three elements if you've got sources on it. Source on a question on it, but evaluate the view that the Supreme Court has too much influence over the executive or too much influence over Parliament. Both of those would be kind of potential questions. Again, you can use stuff on component one to do with democracy in there as well. It's one of those where you should be able to build a relatively balanced point on that in terms of the role that the Supreme Court plays, where it has shown a degree of power. It is again, this links with constitutional stuff as well. It is fundamentally not in a great place because it was created by Parliament, and therefore, I mean, Johnson did talk about this when he was getting really angry about the judgment over proroguing Parliament. It's created by Parliament, therefore it could be destroyed by Parliament, and Human Rights Act, which is something that is very significant in terms of its interpretation of that in relation to government legislation. Well, the Human Rights Act may go as well. So there is plenty of kind of up to date debate that you could delve into on that one. So the final part of the paper is your non-core ideology. So I teach nationalism. And so you will find lots of stuff on nationalism in the playlist, and again, there's links to those videos on there. You need to know the core ideas and principles, the differing views within nationalism, and the key thinkers and their ideas. Now, it's the same layout for the different the different ideologies. So it's always core principles and ideas, differing tensions, and the key thinkers. And the key thinkers is absolutely key, because that's where the vast majority of your examples and stuff should come from. I always advise my students to try and use at least 3 of those 5 key thinkers in any response that they give, and I will be the same across all of them. There are always highlighted this idea that you need to know about human nature, society, economy, the state. I mean, I think sometimes with the non-core ideologies, questions centered on those are maybe less straightforward or less easy to set, I think, as questions than they would be maybe in the core ones like liberalism and socialism and conservatism. So that then leads us into, well, what are the key debates in that area? And this will vary from ideology to ideology. But within nationalism, then some of the really big ones are rational versus irrational. So Rousseau it talks about a form of rational nationalism, where people kind of, through civic nationalism, people choose to be part of the nation based on its institutions and things like that. And arguably, you could talk about there's a degree of rationality with Garvey in terms of black nationalism, in terms of a basis of empiricism, of kind of historical evidence of what's happened. There are lots of forms of nationalism which are irrational. So Herder is to do with this kind of Volksgeist, this kind of connection and language and culture. Mazzini rejects rationalism. Maurras his view of internal is kind of a very kind of irrational fueled form of nationalism. Some elements of nationalism are progressive, noticeably Rousseau. There are some progressive elements in Mazzini's work. There is talk about progressiveness in Garvey's writing, and that there are some parts of which are clearly regressive, notably Herder and Maurras. Now, another area, and this is one that we have to be careful we don't completely forget, is this idea: is internationalism compatible with nationalism? And any answer on that should include liberal internationalism and socialist internationalism, because they are both named on the spec and are in the key terms bit. And plus, you could talk about Pan-Africanism under Garvey. So, with that, I mean, one of the main things that a lot of the nationalists agree on is the idea of the nation state. Now, you obviously get very different views on the interaction between those nation states from the likes of Rousseau, which kind of would fit in with the idea of liberal nationalism, internationalism, where you'd have all these nation states kind of coexisting and interacting and getting on, and to the other extreme of Maurras, who would talk about certain nation states having the right to exist and other ones not, and that would link into the ideas of colonialism and imperialism. There has in post-colonial times, and again, we was looking at some examples of this, have been growth of socialism amongst post-colonial ideologies, and that would maybe fit with kind of socialist internationalism. And again, you could bring in the writing of ideas of people like Marx. There are other areas that they could look at. They could look at the significance of race in nationalism, and also in terms of culture and language, and a lot of that reflects the stuff earlier that's in the rational and progressive arguments. And the idea of self-determination versus colonialism, which fits in with that internationalism. Is it compatible with nationalism bit? And you have nationalists who promote the idea of colonialism, and obviously you have nationalists who are anti-colonial, who are looking for freedom for their nation from imperial control. So you get a strong contrast in that one as well. So that's just to give you some ideas of the kind of areas that you might want to look at. But there are also all those kind of ones on human nature and state and society and economy. Though if they ask you economy one, I'd avoid it. It's quite a difficult one on nationalism. So I hope that's been helpful for you and giving you everything you need. There will be a playlist that goes alongside this. It's all the videos that are come up on screen or are mentioned by me will be in that playlist, in helping you prepare for component 2 in the summer of 2022. I'll put all that together and get that out, so help you get on with your revision. If you haven't done so already, then please do subscribe. There's loads of politics stuff on my channel, including how to do all the different question types and how to address the three assessment objectives, as well as content on all elements of the course. There is also a huge amount of history stuff on there as well. So if you're doing A-level history, you might well find stuff relevant to your units there, or if you're just interested in history. Right, thank you very much for watching.